Good day, and welcome to another TD production for Grade 10 Optics. Today we're going to be learning about the microscope. And my goal for you today is to learn how light travels from a very small object on your stage here through a first convex lens, forming an image in the tube, where it's further magnified by a second lens called the objective or the ocular, and then your brain interprets that as a much, much larger image of your tiny microscopic object down below. And what do I want from you? I hope that by the end of this, you can draw ray diagrams to explain how that happens, how light travels from our object, forms a larger, inverted, and real image inside the tube, and how, once it comes through here, through your eyepiece, that your eye and your brain interpret that as a larger still image that is still inverted, but it's a virtual image. It requires your eye and your brain to make it worthwhile or useful. Okay, well, let's talk a bit more about microscopes before we get to the technical details of the physics behind them. Historically, they've only been around for about 3.5 centuries. Antonin van Leeuwenhoek gets credit for some of that work, although many lens makers at the time vied for the title for the father of modern compound microscopes. In so doing, he got to take a look at things like plant cells, at sex cells, human sex cells, how a pond water is teeming with its own version of life, and got to see things that were starting to make us sick, and we didn't really understand that before. Things like giardia. Giardia is a really terrible little creature that lives in the intestines of beavers, where I'm from in northern Ontario, and if it gets into your intestines, it will make you cleaner than the day you were born. You will suffer a lot. And it causes things like diarrhea, which is still a leading cause of death in young children in developing nations in our world. So understanding microbiology is essential, and it's the reason that half of you are alive today. I hope to be able to prove that to you by the end of this. So let's go take a look at a couple things. First of all, we're used to microscopes vertically, and yet we're used to our ray diagrams drawn horizontally. So what we'll be doing is we're imagining that we're flipping this microscope down on its back so that the objective lens is to the left and that the eyepiece is to the right. So it's just as if we'd taken this and knocked it down to the right. Okay, so let's label some of those things. So the place that your object is placed, it's usually on a stage, on a slide. And so if this is our stage, we would have our light source on the bottom down here. And your eye would be all the way up here. And in between would be a tube. Okay, well, light comes and either transmits through your small microscopic object here, or we have lit it from the side. That's another option. And that light is going to go in all directions, but we're only going to focus on 2 rays of light. We're going to focus on one that comes in parallel to the primary axis, so make that as parallel to this first line as possible. And we've learned in previous lessons that if a ray of light comes in parallel to a primary axis, it's going to refract, and the net result of all that refracting is that it's going to bend down through the first focal point right here. Any ray that comes in through the center, so try to get your rays to start at exactly the same spot, and try to get it to go right through the center. Any of those rays are going to cross eventually, and if we have our eye over here, it's going to trick us into thinking that there is a bigger upside down and real image right here. We'll see what we had at the beginning, but bigger and upside down, and it will be real. So this is similar to the scenario 3. It is scenario 3 from what we learned earlier. And so if you are at slightly greater than 1F, but less than 2F, this will be our first image. It will form inside the tube. Just remember that the tube is just that section separating out our bottom lens and our top lens, so that image would form somewhere in here. I'm going to zoom down to the very bottom of our screen. And before we forget, our image one properties, well, it's a microscope, so it shouldn't come as a tremendous surprise that we're going to make something larger. In addition to that, it's going to be inverted. And that's very frustrating when you're working with microscopes until you eventually get used to it, because it means if you move your slide left, what you see moves right. If you move it up, it moves down. And the final thing is that it's real. And that's going to be very important because real images mean that light has actually traveled out this way. And if it has, no matter where we put our eye over beyond these crossed rays, we're going to see an image right there. And that image, therefore, is light going in a bunch of different directions. And we haven't explained all the rules of how that would come, but suffice to say that this light from the image is going to come out in a whole bunch of different directions, including a ray that comes through the center of our second lens. And remember that if that ray comes through the center, then be picky that it goes through the crosshairs. That'll go into your eye. And so that ray, well, this one will come up parallel to the primary axis. And now that one would have also come from our light source over here, from our object. It would have come through our lens, it would have come to here. But if a ray of light comes in parallel to our primary axis, it's going to spread out like this. So you'll see that our rays are spreading. That means they're diverging, which means that our eye interprets that as light that has come from behind the lens. And remember that our eyes also assume that light travels in straight paths. So I'm going to extend my ray a long way this way. In fact, I may even have to shrink this down a little bit more. So our eye is assuming that our orange ray came from far, far away. It's also going to assume that our green ray does the same. So they're going to cross over here somewhere. And don't worry if your rays don't cross exactly where mine do. Remember that with optical devices, a slight change by a millimeter or so will change where the focus is entirely. Okay, so back to exactly where the rays cross. So this pink arrow represents what our brain imagines it is seeing and what makes sense to it. Our second image is going to be larger a second time. So no surprise there. Again, this is a microscope after all, and its goal is to make things bigger. Now it has remained inverted. Anytime you are at less than one focal length, your image properties are normally larger and right side up and virtual. But because our image right here is upside down, it remains upside down. So our final property, what we actually see when we look through a microscope, is that our image is larger times 2. It's upside down. Everything is backwards in a microscope. And it's a virtual image, so we have to look through it. Well, what is that overall magnification? It depends. A lot of modern microscopes have 3 objective lenses at 4 times, 10 times, and 40 times. And usually the eyepiece is a 10 times magnifier. So if you multiply the 2 factors together, you can either get 40 times total magnification, 100, or 400 times. And that allows you to see a lot of things. Bacteria are a little bit small to see at that range, but you can get better lenses even than that. So who cares? What difference does it make that we study microscopes? I told you that half of you are alive today because of it. You're also much richer because of it. Well, how's that possible? Let's go talk a little story. I popped over to a website called Gapminder.org, and it's one of my favorite nerd sites that shows 200 years of global data in about a minute and a half. So you can see in the background the years are counting on, and on our y-axis we have life expectancy, and on our x-axis we have income. And over the course of almost 100 years, you'll notice that these dots, which represent countries, okay, so the big green dot is always the United States over here, the small green dot is Canada, The yellow dots represent European countries. So the colors represent regions. Yellow is Europe, green is the Americas, red is Asia and South Asia, and blue is Africa. Those regions show that life expectancy, even 100 years ago, had improved for a small portion of our planet. That's because microscopes, initially developed by some of those early European thinkers, allowed people to see microbiology, and we started to boil water and we started to bleach surfaces. Around this time, we started to think maybe we should wash our hands between surgeries, for example. It wasn't a tidy time of life, and infant mortality and mortality in general was quite high. We move forward a little bit more, and you're going to see what the influence now, Spanish flu was. So now we are after World War I. We saw the Spanish flu, and we saw a whole bunch of dots suddenly drop down. But now we'll move forward. We're into the Depression, and then you see World War II suddenly has a huge drop. So a lot of people killing each other then. But World War II represents the introduction of Sir Alexander Fleming's invention of antibiotics, of penicillin. And in 1945, in fact 1944, at the invasion of Normandy, finally production of penicillin increases to a point where it's available to all the Allied soldiers. Shortly thereafter, it's available to the whole world. And watch as some of our poorer countries from Asia and Africa that have been left behind from the scientific and industrial revolutions, given the gift of antibiotics, suddenly kids stop dying so much. Longevity increases significantly, and there's still tragic stories of dots that are crashing all over the place. War is a tough thing. But notice that all the countries by today, or close to today, look, life expectancy is above 50 for every country in the world. Every country is better than Canada was 200 years ago, and it's significantly due to antibiotic use. My grandpa was in World War II. He received antibiotics when a shell exploded close to his head. In World War I, he would have likely died, but in World War II, there was no infection, and he was back fighting after about a week. I know that I received a blood infection due to a spring launching off my underneath my fridge in kind of a dirty environment there, and it plunged into my finger. And within 24 hours, I couldn't bend my finger, and there were red lines going up my arm. I had blood poisoning. I had about 24 hours to write a will and another 24 hours of delirium, and then I would have died. But instead, I got antibiotics and I lived. And my own kids have had bouts of ear infections and strep throat and infant diarrhea, and it was because of antibiotics that they were able to live. You notice that with the rise of the dots also came an increase in wealth. This is in today's dollars. Canada used to be very poor. So did most countries. But now we're not. On average, you got Canadians earning somewhere in the ballpark of $45,000 American. That's not bad. What that means is that think of how much you are worth. Every single teenager in Canada is worth at least $250,000. When we put up all the money that your parents and grandparents and society has put into you, your education alone has been $10,000 at least a year, whether that be at an independent school or whether that be public school. Someone had to pay it through taxes. Your clothing, think of how much your clothing costs. Think of how much food you've eaten, how many diapers you went through, how much your skating lessons or swimming lessons or soccer or hockey or whatever your sport may be, your music lessons. Think of all those trips that you've been on. Those things have made you what you are. And that's the investment we put into you. We've put in $250,000 into you already. And if a young life is taken from us, we lose all that investment. But if you live to a ripe old age and get to start doing amazing things after education is done here at high school, you are starting to give back, and that's really valuable. You're going to build the bridges I drive across. You're going to take care of me when I'm a senior citizen. Please be nice. So these represent a huge change in our lifestyle and our society. We are wealthier and we live longer because of the gift of antibiotics. So, why bother study microscopes? Microscopes radically transform the world around us. My goal for you is to not only to be able to draw a ray diagram and explain how we magnify our object and make it bigger once, and we send that light through a second lens and make it larger again, but for you to appreciate the fact that you are likely alive because scientists along the way who invented the microscope, discovered microbiology, and then discovered antibiotics to help benefit society have kept you alive. Thanks for studying the microscope with me. This is TV Physics.